So what do Dutch school books say about the dark history of the Netherlands? What do Dutch pupils actually learn about the dark Dutch historical past? In this video we're going to look at Dutch school books that write about the war crimes of Dutch during the Indonesian War of Independence. Are school kids in this country learning enough about this subject, or too little, and when is enough enough? I'm a history teacher and I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, before we're going to get into the interesting stuff, I want to give some information about the Dutch school system. Depending on which level you're at, you follow a 4, 5 or 6 year course on secondary Dutch school. Now, in the last years, the Dutch government implemented a system of time periods when it comes down to the education of history. So there's the time period of hunter-gatherers, that's number 1. Number 2 is the classical period. Then number 3 is the early Middle Ages. Number 4 is the late Middle Ages. And it goes all the way to 10 when you have the time period of television and computer. And these time periods are also used on primary school. Now we're going to look at the following two: the time of world wars, 1900 till 1950, and time of television and computers, 1950 till now. Now, each time period has its characteristics, aspects attached to it. For example, looking at time period 10, television and computers, there is aspect 45, decolonization, that puts an end to the Western hegemony in the world. And these characteristic aspects are linked with core concept, in this case, decolonization. And that is where you can put in the Indonesian War of Independence, in the Netherlands referred to as the police action. When I was in secondary school, I had this book, Sporen, Traces, and let's take a look about what the writers of this book write about the Indonesian War of Independence. Okay, looking at the index at chapter 6, the non-Western world in the 20th century, there are 4 paragraphs and 1 is about Indonesia. Let's take a look. Okay, inside this paragraph, 3 periods are distinguished. First, the colonial period until 1942. Second, the transition period from 1942 till 1945, when the Indonesians were working on their independence and the Dutch still believed it was their colony. And third, the post-colonial period from 1949. Now, I'd find this periodization odd, to say the least. I mean, the second one, from 1942 till 1945, Indonesia was on its turn colonized by the Japanese. It was a brutal period where many Indonesians perished, whether in forced labor, whether in famine, or straight outright terror. Yet, I do have to mention that obviously Indonesia was granted some independence by the Japanese. For example, having management functions that never happened under the Dutch. And then from 45 to 49, the Dutch deployed troops to subdue the Indonesian Republic. So let's take a look at the elaboration of the transitional period. Now, okay, this chapter isn't filled with much learning text. Pupils have to make assignments and use sources. Okay, so source 8 mentioned the Bersia period. It was a short time after the Second World War that lasted till around 1946, where basically armed Indonesian nationalist youngsters ran amok and killed countless of Europeans and Indo-Europeans, or slaughtered, I should say. It was really brutal. This source states that it was not only Europeans that had the risk of being killed, but also many local Indonesian rulers. The Bersia period was a period where all those whose power wasn't recognized ran the risk of being killed. Source 13 mentions a British officer at the end of 1946. He states that the British troops had a ceasefire with these Indonesian nationalists, and then they handed over their positions to the Dutch, who went berserk by firing thousands of rounds in the first night and gunned down people, among which civilians, whether out of zeal or inexperiencedness, and with total disregard of the actual situation. Okay, so this book doesn't really elaborate too much on the Indonesian War of Independence. First, because it's a part of a bonus chapter. I can't actually remember we touched upon this. Probably we didn't treat it. Second, it has a different format because it contains not learning text but sources where pupils have to make assignments on. Okay, so therefore we're going to take a look at this book from 2006. Okay, I mentioned before that in recent years the Dutch government implemented the time period system. Now, before that, and that's what I remember from high school exams, pupils did their ending exam in 2 subjects. So for example, I did my end exam of history about industrialization and the Vietnam War. Each year, 1 subject would be the same and the other one would be replaced. So for example, I did my exams in 2005, and in 2006 there was the Vietnam War, still from previously year, and Industrial Revolution was replaced by the history of education. When I was a pupil, we always joked around that when it came down to the 2 subjects of history exam, there was always one interesting topic and one not so interesting topic. So let's take a look at one of the interesting subjects from 2006. This one was the colonial relationship between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. And let's take a look at chapter 5, where it basically talks about the history of 1945 till 1963, from Dutch East Indies to Indonesia. Now here you see they have a special paragraph dedicated to the Bersia period I mentioned before, and here they speak about Dutch war crimes, exception or rule? And they mentioned that the Dutch war crimes in Indonesia were elaborated on during a Dutch broadcast that was aired while the Vietnam War was going on. A Dutch veteran's eyewitness account is written where he says that Indonesian villages were riddled with bullets, horrifying torture methods were implemented during interrogations, and acts of revenge were carried out, all of which had no military use. Further, I read another Dutch eyewitness account. They, the Dutch soldiers, were assigned to shoot all boys above the age of 16 and all men. Can you explain what's the difference between this and Putten? And Putten is a Dutch village that shared a similar fate during the Second World War. Lastly, a Dutch commander speaks his mind and he says terrible things might have happened, but most Dutch soldiers behaved correctly and the Dutch High Command did not encourage these atrocities. Now this Dutch broadcast led to an investigation by the Dutch government that concluded that war crimes have been committed by the Dutch, although these were incidental and not structural. And that makes the whole thing very topical, because in recent years this book here has been published, and now the Dutch government is doing yet another investigation about the Dutch use of excessive violence during the Indonesian War of Independence, because this book definitely claims that the use of excessive violence by the Dutch was not incidental but structural. Now this book is not in use anymore, so let's take a look at a Dutch history textbook that is still in use today, and I'm talking about Geschiedenis Werkplaats, History Workplace. Okay, so chapter 10, paragraph 1 elaborates on the Indonesian War of Independence. The paragraph's name is Decolonization, and it basically touches upon multiple countries, among which of them Indonesia. It states the Netherlands chose for violence. It actually calls the Indonesian War of Independence the Politionele Acties, the police actions, which is actually the name the Dutch have given to the conflict. It states the following: Dutch troops sometimes responded with excessive violence, like in the Javanese village of Rawagede. On the 9th of December 1947, they ambushed the village thinking there were armed guerrilla fighters. This wasn't the case, yet after interrogation, all male inhabitants were shot dead. And that's basically it. No further context or whatsoever. Just a very small tiny paragraph about the Indonesian War of Independence in a Dutch history textbook. Yet it does touches upon one of the most notorious war crimes committed by the Dutch during this Indonesian War of Independence. So is it this short out of bad will? I don't think so. I think it's obviously because there's so much material that has to be covered these days that there isn't room for everything. And I still think that even with this tiny excerpt, they did a fairly good job. But I do need to mention that I don't think it's good that such interesting topics are basically pushed aside by the huge amount of material that has to be covered because the Dutch government want us to cover that. However, as a history teacher, I do have a certain amount of freedom of movement, and what I offer my pupils is a practical assignment where they have to write a paper about the Indonesian War of Independence, and I've clearly noticed that pupils and even their parents are really interested in it and really appreciated that I'm touching upon this very tragic but fascinating piece of history. And I say that's just what I love about my job as a teacher. Now, if you want to know more about this Indonesian War of Independence, you can click right here to check out the video that I made on location in Jakarta. If you want to support me in my history endeavors, please go to my Patreon page, because with your donations I can keep doing this and expand. I want to thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe. See you later.